welcome to this episode of the Antelope Hill Book Club podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Taylor Young,
I'm Sean Bell.
and today we are discussing the book Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, and we are also going to be discussing the movie Apocalypse Now. Both versions of the movie, actually, because it turns out that we've each seen one of the versions. So we'll be able to talk about both of those. So I read this book a long time ago, and I reread it now. It was always one of my favorite books, although I have some critical thoughts of it as well. But Shawn, I believe that you read it recently and you wanted to do an episode on it. So give us your opening thoughts, I guess, and then where you want to go from there with talking about it.
Well, so I suppose that the internet right is one of very few sectors of humanity where the question of colonialism and empire and peoples dominating other peoples, where that's actually a question, and there's not just limp platitudes about self-determination, which don't really make sense with the anti-nationalist prevailing worldview, right? It's a very present question among people of our ilk, I think, how we should relate to, well, the domination of people by other people, where they're in with the whole spectrum of opinion going from nationalism for all, not even just white people, all subgroups of white people, and all other peoples, having their right to national territories, to pro-white viewpoints, which are more, whether accepting of imperialism and colonialism in the classical sense, or at least making the argument that petty nationalism is actually to the detriment of white racial interests. So with these questions in the ether of the internet ecosystem where I live, reading things about colonialism is interesting. That's one part of it, and I don't know. I also find it refreshing to get a taste of anti-colonial stuff that's of a very different sort than the sort of stuff that gets bandied about today. It's not sappy and sentimental, and it's not a book that idealizes the colonized peoples in any way.
Well, like anti-colonialism today is really mainly something that just exists downstream of all of the anti-white messaging and the anti-white political theories and the people who push those. It's really arguable whether it does anything even on its own terms for the darker peoples of the world. And certainly when I was in school, I also found it kind of intellectually interesting, mainly just because it was critical, at least ostensibly critical of liberalism, of the system that we live under. But when you like dig into it, then you can't avoid that the way that anybody who like believes this stuff today talks is really just boils down to being anti-white, and there's not a whole lot more that you could squeeze out of it than that. So I agree. It's actually only like people like us who are kind of interested in these questions on their own terms, not just as a proxy for racial resentment.
Yeah, it's for sure. And yeah, Conrad in Heart of Darkness focuses a whole lot more on the degrading qualities of the colonial enterprise for the whites who are the colonizers. Just at every stage, he depicts the colonizers as being, engaged in pettiness and absurdity, and trying to cover it with a very, very thin and transparent veneer of what we would recognize today as basically shit libbery. Right? It's one of those funny things where the same people who are pushing the anti-white thing would have been the same people talking about like we need to civilize the savages and whatever.
So you would say that the book is ultimately a criticism of colonialism, uh,
Ultimately, yeah, I wouldn't
or like
necessarily say that that's the core or the kernel or the most interesting thing about it, but
okay.
as far as the book's attitude towards colonialism, my impression was that it is unambiguously negative. I'm willing to be convinced otherwise.
No, I wouldn't disagree with that. I honestly And maybe, maybe I'm telling on myself. Maybe I'll just sound like a pleb here. But, and again, I read this book a long, long time ago when I was a lot younger, and it really enjoyed reading it. But I always had the thought, like, what's the big point of this whole thing? What am I actually supposed to get out of it? And my conclusion is that while I still like it, maybe this is the wrong way of going about it. I don't mean to set this up to be too negative, but well, I didn't have a good conclusion, I think, at the time. I think that one of the strong points of the book is it evokes emotions while you're reading it. It gives you a certain feeling and a certain atmosphere. And I think that it has like a or I've always perceived that it has like a reputation that there's some tremendously profound thing that it's telling you. And I don't know if you've ever seen actually a meme about this. I don't know if you've seen the meme format where like someone's looking at a book and something's going over their head. Have you seen that?
Uh, I think not, maybe.
Okay, so it's like you have your Wojak observer. He's looking at the book and he's like really blown away by the profound message. The profound message is like, wow, the evils of colonialism and capitalism and imperialism is so profound. And then what's going over his head is Africa sucks.
Okay.
So I think that sells it a bit short. I do think there's more to it than that, but I also think that maybe I'm really just talking to myself. Maybe I'm just talking to my older, or my younger self who read the book. And if I could go back in time, I would just tell him it ain't that deep, bro. That's it. Like
I don't know. I don't think that I agree with that. I think that like if there is
okay, good. I'm glad you don't.
okay, let me see if I can manage to speak and get to a point here. Okay, so one quote that I will introduce here, and I might just introduce a bunch of pieces of evidence, and you might have to help me winnow it down to a point. But do you remember at the beginning where we're in the frame story? It's Marlow in the boat with the unnamed narrator before Marlow starts talking about the Congo, and he says, "And this has also been one of the dark places of the earth." Right? And he's talking about London, the greatest city in the world, at least at this time. Right,
Yep.
and there's a paragraph or two when he muses about ancient England from the point of view of the Roman, as also the mouth of the River Thames as being something analogous to the Congo and the journey into the heart of darkness, this totally savage land. So that's one thing that I will introduce. The other thing that I will introduce is Kurtz one of the sort of do-gooders?
I
Is
would
he
say yes.
yeah, so he's portrayed as I wanted to confirm that I'm remembering this right. That part of his reputation comes from the fact that he is, at least in his European self, is a member of this benighted class who likes to believe, at least, that the colonial enterprise has something to do with enlightenment or whatever.
Yeah. Yes.
I think that we can find evidence of that at some later junction, bolster that point, but there's evidence for it somewhere. Now you take these things together, every place on the earth is one of the dark places, and in the heart of every man lies that same primordial darkness as well. There's a great passage that I'm looking for in my notes where Marlowe talks about the horror of beholding the African savages, and it's not in their difference, it's in the suspicion of their similarity. Do you remember this?
I do remember it. I can probably find it if you give me a second.
Let's both look. I got it.
Okay.
The earth seemed unearthly. We are accustomed to look upon the shackled form of a conquered monster, but there you could look at a thing monstrous and free. It was unearthly, and the men were, no, they were not inhuman. Well, that was the worst of it. The suspicion of their not being inhuman. It would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you just the thought of their humanity, like yours. The thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. Ugly. Yes, it was ugly enough. But if you were man enough, you could admit to yourself, that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise. A dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you so remote from the night of first ages, could comprehend. Do you see sort of what I'm getting at here? The point that I'm not quite converging on? I think that's the kernel of it. The anti-colonial thing is, I don't know,
Well,
go on.
I think there's to be it suggests a pretty obvious devil's advocate point to make here, which I'm not necessarily saying I'm convinced is what you should get out of the book, but like, isn't this just saying that we're all the same inside, and race doesn't matter, and we're just like the Africans in some way deep down,
Well, we
so
are,
we
but that's,
shouldn't be so mean.
I don't know that it's saying that. No, I don't know. I mean, because I think it all sort of depends on what question you're asking. Whether you answer yes, we are the same as blacks. No, we are different from blacks. Right? If you're zooming out and talking about us as animate carbon-based life forms, then probably from that distance, it makes sense to say that we're the same. Right, and if you're talking about us as animals and talking about our basest desires, if you're doing the liberal thing where you focus on like, yeah, well, everybody wants to have shelter and a full belly and meaningful personal connections of some kind. If you're at that level of resolution and you're talking about things where it makes sense to be at that level of resolution, then I think it's reasonable to talk about us as all being the same. The problem is that that's not the appropriate level of resolution for questions of politics. Right, on the level of politics, where you have to zoom in a little bit more and consider these particularities that aren't relevant to other sorts of questions, then we are very different. I don't know. If Conrad is saying that, then bummer. There's a real invaluable thing there about the thin veneer that civilization really is, right? And the wild, brutal, primordial thing which lies concealed and is not that far from the surface, even though we, well fed members of the Golden Billion, have never been in direct contact with it ourselves.
Yeah, well, to go back to an earlier thing you said, all the European, or almost all, I think, the Europeans who are participating in the colonial projects in Africa, all the Europeans in Africa in this book are portrayed negatively, pretty much. They're all portrayed as like thinking of themselves as so much greater than they are, and being just kind of like petty, conniving, greedy, shiftless people. I do like that part of it because it's not like white people can't be like that, right? And you could say maybe, especially in circumstances like this, I don't know if that's entirely true. Maybe you could write a story in which you bring out how colonialism also would have had to bring out certain positive traits in whites, but it can certainly bring out negative ones as well. So I do appreciate that, and I always think it's important to be able to criticize ourselves because otherwise we tend to make excuses for things.
Is anyone portrayed positively in the book, now that I think about it?
Any white
Mar-
character or any
Marlowe
character at
is.
all.
Marlowe
Marlowe
definitely is by the anonymous narrator.
Marlowe has some sympathy for some of the black workers on the steamboat, like the guy who steers the boat and the guy who tends the fire. The one well, to me, the most noteworthy white character who's portrayed positively was the mechanic who helps him work on the steamboat, which I thought was interesting. Is probably an intentional contrast of like the one person here who's working with his hands and doing something productive is a good, decent guy, a family guy, and so on.
Yeah, the guy with the all he talks about is his kids and his pigeons.
Yes,
Isn't
yep, that guy.
Yeah, I don't know that I would, as far as the black characters you mentioned, I don't know if I would call that a positive portrayal, right? Unless we're saying that pity is positive. But
It
I
can
you know,
be. I think pity can be positive, or it's like sympathy for the cannibal here.
it seems like a modern lib would read a portrayal like that and be like, "Oh, he's depriving them of all agency," right? Like it's so
Hmm.
he's looking down on them so much, right? The guy who's been told that I forget the details of it, but he's tending the fire with such care just because he's been told that like
Hmm.
the demons will get angry and sink the
Yes.
boat if he doesn't do it. I mean, it's I don't know. I perhaps you could say it's less negative than the petty bite
Well, I think
backbiting white character.
there's a contrast in that Marlowe has some admiration for just his hard work, which I don't know. Maybe that isn't the intention, but I feel like it's conspicuous because of how much it goes out of the way to establish that none of the other white characters are really people of work, so to speak. Except, I guess, the manager in his own sense, but he's evil in other ways. So everyone else is pretty much just like they're just coasting along, and it's almost like they're on vacation. Is kind of the feeling that I think you're supposed to get.
Interesting. Yeah, well, and I suppose if we're going to go with my theory that the fundamental thing that the book is presenting as the truth is like that the primordial is the true fundamental thing and civilization is a false thing, then I mean there's ample room in that way of thinking for noble savage type beliefs,
See,
right? Like
so here I'll push back a little bit because I think we're getting to something now, and I would disagree with thinking about the book that way. I think the book, and I only really had this thought the very last time that I was reading it, which was yesterday. But the book is about civilization. That's my take. And it's about how civilization is necessary, and when we remove ourselves from civilization, then bad things happen. And I don't know. And frankly, I tend to not care what the authors think about things that they write. But I don't know if there's necessarily like a complete mapping of that onto colonialism. I don't know if that's necessarily should be taken to imply that like you should never go to you should never explore the Congo River for ivory because, you'll go crazy. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but it is certainly a warning about, like I was saying earlier, some of the vices that colonialism does bring out in people and that has brought out historically in our people that we should guard ourselves against. But I want to look for a couple quotes here to establish what I'm saying. So while I'm doing that, do you have any response?
I definitely do, yeah, because I don't know. At the same time as I see what you're saying, right? Like man removed from civilization descends into barbarie and madness. That's right there on the surface for sure. And yet the things we would the humanist ideals and just all these very sweet charitable thoughts that the fancy ladies at the company have, right? Those which probably would be portrayed as the most civilized parts of civilization, right? All those very sweet ideas about the brotherhood of man and lifting up the savages into civilization, those are definitely lampooned, right? So maybe it's one of those books where there's no solution and just darkness, or maybe it's one of those things where
I
you
have
know
I have an
go
explanation for that, but
go.
it's a two-part thing. So I think we need to tackle the civilization thing first, and then we'll circle back to that because I think it's part of something else. I don't see it as part of the criticism of civilization. So this is actually right after the passage that you were reading about the earth seemed unearthly and the screaming cannibals. And so Marlowe begins reflecting on this situation and the idea that he says, yes, it was ugly enough, but if you were man enough, you would admit to yourself that there was in you just the faintest trace of a response to the terrible frankness of that noise, a dim suspicion of there being a meaning in it which you, so remote from the night of first ages, could comprehend. And why not? The mind of man is capable of anything because everything is in it, all the past as well as all the future. What was there after all? Joy, fear, sorrow, devotion, valor, rage, who can tell? But truth. Truth stripped of its cloak of time. Let the fool gape and shudder. The man knows and can look on without a wink, but he must at least be as much of a man as those on the shore. He must meet that truth with his own truth stuff, with his own inborn strength. Principles won't do. Acquisitions, clothes, pretty rags, rags that would fly off at the first good shake. No, you want a deliberate belief. So there's similar passages that are repeated throughout the book, and I want to read at least one more. And when he talks about Kurtz, I think he also, when the character thinks about Kurtz and what happened to him, he kind of analyzes him from this same perspective, that you show up to this land that's completely savage, and it's got these naked cannibals running around and screaming and banging on their war drums. But he says that you can feel a suspicion that it does have some meaning to. It's kind of this is basically exactly what you were talking about earlier. And so it's, I don't know how exactly to say it. It's a challenge, it's a temptation, it's both of those things, and maybe more things beyond besides that. It's something that someone needs, like he says here, his own inborn strength to fight against, so he doesn't succumb to it and become savage, I suppose. Except for the fool, funnily enough, this is not the only place he says it, but he says a fool is always safe. And another place he says, well, the fool is safe from the devil because he's either too much of a fool or the devil's too much of a devil for them to make a bargain like he would with a stronger man. So there is something out there in the bush, in the wilderness, that a man needs to have a defense against. His inborn strength or a deliberate belief, he also says here. You want a deliberate belief. So there's something he has to defend himself against. And I think what I get out of it is that there is something that we've achieved through our collective civilization that is necessary. And that's why I said that I disagree in seeing the point of the book being to just boil it down to, we're all kind of like primordially the same and civilization is just like a specter. I would say the opposite, that civilization is the most concrete thing in the book because it is portrayed as something that's absolutely necessary, without which we descend into spiritual and physical darkness.
Maybe,
So,
Taylor, it's the communion of the two, right?
mhm.
Like, if you're living in the sepulchral city in this world of phantoms, if you're in your fancy office talking about grand ideals, and meanwhile, sending a bunch of pirates to go brutalize the countryside for ivory, that's ridiculous. That's absurd and grotesque, no matter what you think about the ethics of colonialism. It's grotesque because there's such a departure between what you think is happening and what the reality is. And yet, to succumb to darkness and go all the way in the way that Kurtz does, that's presumably not the answer either. But yeah, maybe what it is that, like, you need to go and see that thing. You need to, oh, what's the quote from the movie? You need to make a friend of horror and moral terror, right? But you need to pull back and not be consumed by the heart of darkness. I don't know, but
I don't
yeah,
know. I think it could be. That's something that I'm not sure of either what I think the message I'm supposed to get is, or what the message that I want to get is. I'm not sure either way whether it's you need to confront the horror or not, because you could also interpret just that, for lack of a better term, like don't try to be so special. Just here let me read this other example. So here he's talking about Kurtz, and kind of like you were saying, I think this is after he meets Kurtz, or he's kind of reflecting on after he meets Kurtz, and Kurtz would talk about my intended, my ivory, my station, my river, everything belonged to him. He had taken a high seat among the devils of the land. And so then Marlowe is kind of talking to the audience now. You can't understand. How could you? With solid pavement under your feet, surrounded by kind neighbors ready to cheer you or to fall on you, stepping delicately between the butcher and the policeman, in the holy terror of scandals and gallows and lunatic asylums. How could you imagine what particular region of the first ages a man's untrammeled feet may take him into by way of solitude, utter solitude without a policeman? By the way of silence, where no warning voice of a kind neighbor can be heard whispering of public opinion. These little things make all the difference. When they are gone, you must fall back upon your own innate strength, upon your own capacity for faithfulness. And this is where he talks about no fool ever made a bargain with his soul for the devil. The fool is too much of a fool, or the devil too much of a devil. I don't know which. He also talks about, so I think when he sees the heads on the stakes, about how it seemed to him a illustration of there being something lacking in Kurtz's ability to restrain his own lusts that Kurtz himself was probably unaware of until the very end. So I don't know that I would necessarily say that the lesson is you have to go and look at the darkness. I think I would argue that it's more that you should be willing to face it when you have to, for sure. You shouldn't be fascinated by it. Yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
Do you, do you remember we're back in the frame story again. Do you remember the way that the anonymous narrator contrasts Marlowe to sailors? Where he describes the average sailor as actually being more of a homebody than a traveler. It's just that his home is a ship, right? All ships are kind of the same, and the sea is kind of the same everywhere you go, and all of the different shores that they step off of the boat for a moment to see, they don't really make an impression, and they end up being sort of disdainful of it. It doesn't change them.
Yeah.
I Yeah, well, again, maybe this is me seeing what I want to see. I am fascinated, right? I am drawn to, I want those swarming hives of weirdness and barbarism to make their impression on me somehow. So maybe I'm seeing what I want to see, but I do think that Marlowe is portrayed at various points as being not just a positive character, but maybe not heroic. I don't know. And also, yeah, to relate that back to who is positively portrayed, I would definitely say that Marlowe, in the eyes of the anonymous narrator in the frame story, is a positive character, positive white
I would
character.
agree with that because if you kind of step back and think about it, he talks about himself as experiencing some of the same pulls that Kurtz did, but they don't have the same effect on him. So he seems to fall into his own categorization of the man who is not a fool, who meets with the horror of the unknown, and he requires either a faith or a belief or his own natural strength to resist it. And he does seem to resist it. And I guess what does that mean? And again, I think it's partly just he maintains his attachment to civilization because I don't think that the book is intended or that I would get out of it the intention of just like you should never go to distant shores. You should never want to see this complete difference or even the savagery and the darkness. I think it's I mean colonialism was inevitable. It was inevitable just by a fact of the difference between European civilization and other civilizations. So I think it's kind of pointless to make it out to be just like a complete anti-colonialist thing. And when I make my argument about civilization, it also isn't to say that it means like everyone should stay home, but it is to say that I think the point is that you can be presented with a temptation that is strong because it does appeal to something that genuinely fascinates and that is a genuine desire and not like an inherently wrong desire or not like an inherently wrong fascination. Well, maybe it is an inherently wrong fascination, but in any case, it's something that you have to fight against by maintaining your attachment to civilization. And when you're all alone out there, like Kurtz was, then either you're capable of it or you're not. And maybe no one would have been in his specific situation. Maybe he was too far removed, and any person would have succumbed to the heart of darkness in that way, which I think is part of the lesson. It's kind of like it's not necessarily don't do colonialism, but like here's what happens when you do, and you have to be aware of that, and you have to fight against that, basically.
Well, and maybe it's about the purity of motives too. I saw I don't know. I was scrolling through my notes and I found a passage about the soldiers and clerks that the ship was depositing at the various ports as Marlowe made his journey to the mouth of the river. And I mean, basically, some of them, some I heard got drowned in the surf. But whether they did or not, nobody seemed particularly to care. They were just flung out there and on we went. Right? Or like there's some character who is not a bad guy, but he faints all the time from the heat. And Marlowe asks him, "Hey, what are you even doing here, dude?" And he's like, "I'm trying to make money, right? Trying to make money, trying to ascend into the company. These people of impure motives are certainly very much out of place, and maybe what do you think the thing is that allows Marlowe to resist? What makes him this unique character? Is it just the inward strength? Because what's interesting is that he's not portrayed as having some well articulated, strong belief of the sort that could allow one to resist. And in fact, the character of the strongest belief, namely Kurtz, ends up coming to the conclusion that you have to exterminate the brutes, right? As the postscript to his manuscript says. I don't know. I said a few things. Do you have.
Well, I think that yes, there is definitely a contrast, I think, an intentional contrast between Marlowe and Kurtz. And I don't know if you would necessarily say that Marlowe is a greater man or a stronger man, but he is able to resist a temptation which Kurtz wasn't able to resist. It's also interesting to, like, in light of what you were saying, that, all the other white men are coming here with not pure motives, but there's no indication that Kurtz had impure motives. He seems to have been one of the good ones, if in the context of this conversation, or at least a person who wasn't just driven by greed and selfishness. I don't know. I guess I would just say that that's good, but it's not enough. And I think a big part of it is just his isolation, which to some degree was self-imposed. But I don't know. I guess this is now I come back to like the more libtarded understanding of the book. Maybe it's saying that this is kind of what you were saying at the beginning. The European civilization is just a pretense, and Kurtz is just holding up a mirror to show it how savage it really is, and that's why it wants to get rid of him. That is more explicitly a theme in the movie for sure, because they pretty much say that. Now, again, that isn't ultimately my takeaway, but I think that that's a way you could read the story.
Okay, so there's also another interesting contrast with the manager, who is also remarkably able to resist the various pressures of the jungle. Right? And I think probably he's in the category of like fools who are too foolish for the devil to even strike a bargain with. Just sort of so thoroughly average in every particular that really the only remarkable characteristic about him is that to quote the man himself, he lacks intestines. Right, he just has the ability to be there without getting sick, and that plus his general dullness makes him inert to the
I think
um.
what Marlowe says is that it's impossible to tell what motivates him, and that
Mhm.
gives him an edge in interacting with people who are more transparent.
Yeah, that's. I don't know if I have much to say about it, but it's a type of person for sure, who's able to subsist in any sort of hierarchy and ascend in that hierarchy despite lack of any evident talent, simply because of the stomach to be able to stand it and the strange willingness to hold on.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, I think, something to be gotten out of the fact that there's this whole immense civilization back in Europe that sends Marlowe down there. And when he gets there, he meets all these different characters, and a lot of them are kind of silly in different ways. But they have a system, and so things keep running and they keep working. As like inefficient and as nonsensical as they may sometimes seem, things keep moving along. And there's certainly some savagery to their methods and their way of treating the Africans. And then they go to retrieve this guy, Kurtz, who has gone rogue basically, and they see him with the heads on the sticks, and he's the god of this little tribe, and they just like condemn him and call it a day, basically. Again, I think there's kind of two readings. One, I guess you could focus on how, and like I said, this is made very explicitly in the movie. There's no difference in terms of like barbarism between Kurtz and the others. He just decides to be more honest about it, and therefore they have to get rid of him because they don't like that he's honest about it, which is not all that insightful or useful, I think. The other observation is that I would just bring it back again to civilization. Like the whites that have civilization, even when they're not the best people, things keep running and things keep moving along, and they find ways, even if they're people who don't deserve this, they find ways to like maintain their own positive self-identification against the darkness that's around them. So when it comes to what the author may have meant by this, like I said, I don't know, and I don't really care. I don't think that it fits perfectly well either with our perspective or with like a more liberal perspective that would probably prefer a lot more sympathy for the Africans than is found in the book. But that's what I get out of it. And to go back to something I said earlier, this is half of what I get from it basically is the discussion of civilization. And I think me personally, I separate that from, when you mentioned how he started out with all these humanitarian concerns and, all the best desires of civilizing the natives. And then at the end, he just says, well, exterminate them all. I think that is somewhat of a separate thing. I think that's a commentary on confronting something completely different, which I think is a little bit different from what we've been talking about. Or maybe it's different legs of the same elephant, I suppose. But on one side, you have the civilization that we need to maintain in ourselves as much as, well, yeah, the civilization that we need to maintain in ourselves and through contact with others. And then on the other is just ultimately the inability for anyone to reconcile or synthesize themselves with something that's completely alien and completely different. And that is Kurtz attempting to like find some way of interacting with the savages, either in the Congo or in Vietnam in the movie. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, so just to expand on the very last thing you were saying, the inability to reconcile these extreme differences, or and this is something that's been remarked on many, many times, is that the only way to do it is to go to a lower and lower and lower common denominator. And in this example, like it gets low enough that really all there is primordial, the brutality of the first ages. Interesting though, I noticed. Did you watch the movie before you read the book?
Well, like I said, I read the book a long time ago, and then in both cases, no. I think I watched the movie after I finished reading the book.
That's interesting. Okay, because I don't know. I read an article. Thought I'd consult with the academy and see what they all had to say about it. Got on Google Scholar, reminded myself why I'm not an academic. It's all very bad. But one of the things that was mentioned was how Heart of Darkness now is it's inextricably seen through the lens of Apocalypse Now, and Apocalypse Now is actually sort of the primary thing. It's the thing that has more cultural immediacy. And the reason I bring it up is because yeah, at one point you said you mix the two together. I think, right? You described in Heart of Darkness Mr. Kurtz as having gone rogue, and they're going to retrieve him. But that's the film, unless I misunderstood you.
Um, I don't know. Maybe you have a point. I That is what they're doing in the book, though, too, isn't it? They want to bring him back.
I thought they were
I don't
relieving
know.
him
They
because he was
probably
sick and bringing back Ivory, but don't. There's all that discussion about like, oh, Kurtz, he's gonna be the new guy. He's gonna be the manager. He's gonna be a great man. Back in Europe, he has many influential friends.
yes,
Right?
that's
It's a very
true.
different situation.
It is a bit different, so probably have a point.
Yeah, well, and I'm not just bringing it up to nitpick at you. I thought maybe I'd use that as a jumping off point to just ask you generally how similar the book and the movie really are, and how different they might be. Certainly there are a lot of differences, right? But like to what extent do they affect the conclusions that we draw?
Yeah. I don't know. I think that they can each stand on their own, and I don't know. I've That's something that I was asking myself the whole time as well. Like, to what extent is this telling the same story or a different story? I think there's some differences. I think, like you're pointing out, the idea that they already know that Kurtz has transgressed in some way and they want to bring him back is more apparent, or it's more prominent in the movie. The idea of like him being a criticism of the other Europeans is also more prominent in the movie because, again, Marlowe pretty much says, well, not Marlowe, it's Willard in the movie. He says as much after the whole scene with the napalm. He says something like, well, if these are our methods, then really what's the problem with what Kurtz is doing? And I think he kind of reflects on, or maybe this was just my, I don't remember if he says this explicitly or if it's just like my interpretation, but I think the kind of clear interpretation is, there's no difference really in terms of how barbaric the Americans are versus Kurtz, but they need to maintain to themselves this veneer that they are more civilized. So in those ways, I
Well, throughout
guess
my whole
the
process
movie
of
is, yeah, sorry.
as I was reading and watching, one of the things that I thought I noticed and now I'm not so sure about was so I felt that some of the pettiness was lost in the movie, or is it it doesn't show up in the same way, right? Like the officials of the company with their really all they're spending their time doing is intriguing against each other and trying to scheme to get percentages on ivory and climb the corporate ladder. That that's a different it gives a different note to everything, right? There's certainly absurdity and a certain grotesqueness to a lot of the different episodes in Apocalypse Now. The lieutenant who just wants to go surfing in the middle of the firefight, or the camp they come upon where nobody knows who's in command. There's a similar absurdity, but I think that there's a note of pettiness, and I don't know. I felt like a greater disdain from Conrad for his characters
Hmm.
than is shown in the film.
Yeah, I could see that. I think it probably is enough to say that they're different stories.
Mhm. And I'm trying to think about like did anything about what Mr. Kurtz says in Heart of Darkness when he's interacting with the narrator? Is there anything there that sticks with you? Because I'm having the problem where the thing that comes to my mind is that immortal 4-minute monologue that Marlon Brando does, where his face is partially in shadow and he's talking about it's judgment that defeats us and horror and moral terror are your friends. That whole speech is the thing that I can't get out of my head. But do you remember if there's an analog in Heart of Darkness? And I'll look in the text.
I don't think there is really. In both of them, Kurtz doesn't do a whole lot of speaking. He's kind of just like effectively built up as this person of immense and unique intellect. He doesn't actually do a whole lot of speaking ultimately. I don't remember there being a kind of direct monologue comparison in the book for that. I think he speaks even less in the book.
That's that's interesting, right? And one of the things that I caught the second time I was reading the book was the way that Marlowe finds himself getting caught up in the intriguing, right? He starts portraying himself as having influential European friends and doing little, he taps the side of his nose to suggest that he knows something secret that he doesn't, right? And meanwhile, he's sort of like watching himself do this and wondering about what it is that's catching a hold of him. I don't know that there's anything like that in the film.
Yeah, I don't think so. I will say I think that the decision to write as little dialogue as possible for Kurtz in the book was a good one. It helps to maintain the aura of the character because
Mm.
when you do have, if you have him give a monologue, it better be something good. And not that the one in the movie isn't, but again, that's really the place where my response is just it ain't that deep.
Hmm.
um, but I think not to offend you because it sounded like you liked it a lot. So tell us about Kurtz's monologue.
Uh, no, it's also a question that I had, right? Like, to what extent we should be, rooting around for deep meaning in the ravings of a lunatic. Definitely also true. I don't know. I think that the idea that it's judgment that defeats us, the idea that you have the right to kill me but not to judge me, this is very congruent with the quote you brought up earlier, right? Where Willard says, like, if this is our methods, then what really is the difference? It's congruent with the idea that all Kurtz is really doing is being honest, that the
Yeah,
true thing is.
but I think he's wrong because he does the one thing that gives Willard a right to judge him is that Willard didn't abandon his people and his civilization. And so even if that's the only thing separating them, then it's still a thing of great substance. It's the thing that makes Kurtz silly and Willard not silly or Marlowe not silly. So I don't know. I feel like
even
there's
even when the endeavor of quote your civilization unquote is absurd and grotesque, you ought not to abandon it. You ought
well,
to persist and do your duty.
I don't know if I would necessarily say that that's always the case, but it in Kurtz's case it didn't end up making him more dignified or more civilized, right? Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a good answer, I guess, but
Yeah, no, but
it's certainly true that like Kurtz's thing is just as grotesque as anyone else's. So, but he acts like he's discovered some profound truth about human action. But it hasn't helped him. It hasn't helped him to not be kind of a ridiculous character in his own sense, in his own
mhm.
right.
At what point in the movie are the extra scenes cut in? For the
There's
audience, Taylor watched the Redux. I did not.
yes. So I don't remember all the extra scenes. There's an extra scene with the Playboy models at the. I guess it's at the. There's a place they arrive to that's a camp. They arrive there during the day and it's raining. And I think that's where they can't find a commander. But there's also another place where they can't find a commander. So, but yeah, there's a scene where the soldiers get some time with the Playboy girls. And I don't remember what else there is, but the scene that I think that stands out the most that is in the Redux and not in the original is if you've watched the original first, especially, I think you'll feel like it's really just thrown in there because it really kind of just like happens. I think it's after. I don't remember if there's an attack that precedes it or not, or they just land the boat. I think they come upon this ruin of buildings and they land there, and then there's all these white men with guns, and it turns out that this is an old French plantation and that there's these French people who still live there and they're basically just guarding it against everybody. And they have a very interesting there's a dinner scene where the French officers are talking to Willard, and they talk about how the history from the French perspective, and that they felt like they showed up, they civilized Vietnam, they civilized the natives, they had a good thing going, and then the Americans ruined it because the Americans wanted the French out. So the Americans first funded the Vietnamese communists, and now the Americans are here fighting the Vietnamese communists. And they also explicitly refer to it as a racial thing, that ultimately the Vietnamese, they just want all the white people out, and that's what this is all ultimately about. It's about the white race in
Mm,
Southeast Asia. And it's a very, I think from our perspective, it's very much like it's almost like one of our guys was the character, this French officer character who talks about how, you have this presentation of like these white people who are the most sincere in a sense. They're the ones who lived here. They view this as their land that they fought over, that they bled over, and they just want to stay here. And they're contrasted with everybody else. They're contrasted with their own politicians at home who betrayed the French army and sacrificed it. They're contrasted with the Americans and their empire that just goes around first funding native movements and then fighting them itself and then leaving because it loses as well. They're contrasted with the Vietnamese whom they civilized, and they're kind of like this lone tragic character, and that there's certainly like a tragic fatalistic aspect to them as well, and they're the only ones who are racially aware in the whole movie in that explicit sense. So that is definitely the most interesting scene that is cut out of the original.
Huh. I don't know how that would fit with the overall thrust of the story, but it certainly sounds like something I will have to YouTube after this.
Yeah, it's just very different. It's just in there. I don't think that there's it would be a complete insert in the book. I don't think there's anything like it in the book. Yeah, it's just a very interesting scene. I don't know, it's I guess it if my one criticism is that like it's not really subtle. You know, the character just tells you all this stuff, but I don't know, it's true even if not like there in that specific I don't know if there's a specific plantation that it's based on, but it's certainly true in a general sense of these kinds of dynamics, and probably something that was true in the old days of colonialism as well. In some cases, there was sometimes this aspect to it that wasn't as pro-white as the just kind of overt nature of it would suggest. I think that's generally one of the better criticisms of colonialism and imperialism from our perspective, is that it didn't always end up actually being very pro-European in a collective sense.
Oh yeah, I mean very often it ended up being to the detriment of everybody except the direct profiteers.
We haven't talked as much about the natives and what they have to teach us. And on that subject, I think that the lesson in both the movie and the book is kind of like you were saying, there's some things that are so alien, that are so different, that you can't reconcile yourself to them. And the characters only really think about them in extremes. It's like Kurtz writes that he's like a god to these people because he's so much different, and he's European and they're not. And he starts out by thinking that this presents opportunities to civilize them and to be a force for good, and then at the very end he's just says exterminate them all. And I think in the movie he it's drop the bomb, exterminate them all, or something like that.
Hmm.
So I think that is a lesson that, well, I don't know if that's even necessarily a lesson. I think that's just like an observation. That's just a thing that will always be true. That
The extent that there's a lesson, the lesson is that the natives intuitively grasp this. There's an episode very early in the book where a Dane, a Danish employee of the company, gone sort of mad as a result of his long period of service, ends up getting into a fight with a native chief, and almost hesitantly, reluctantly, full of fear, somebody jabs him with a spear and is surprised to find that yeah, no, it the spear will kill him like it kills anybody else, and they leave the Dane's body to rot untouched and abandon and burn in their own village and flee in superstitious terror. Just to, as I would evaluate it by simple fact of their intuitive grasp of this otherness, this almost like
they have
it's almost
the
like
they have the good sense to recoil from it, is what you're saying.
that's a good way of putting it, Taylor. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, and it's something that can only. It's not even whether or not it corrupts the Europeans, but they don't have a framework for dealing with it. They can't remain what they are, and that's shown in Kurtz specifically. Like whatever he was, he can't remain that thing, and he has to become something else that is, like Marlowe says, he's kicked himself loose from the earth. He's a god unto himself. He can't remain moored to civilization and integrated with this completely alien way of life. So that's would be my final thought, I guess.
Cool. Yeah, I think that maybe the thing is if you're not drawn to go wandering off into the abyss, don't feel bad about that. That's a perfectly reasonable way to live your life. And if the spirit calls you to do that, then, make sure you have something heavy to grab onto so that you don't get whisked away in the whirlwind. Well, and then whatever that heavy thing is, it's going to have to be somewhere deep within you, whether it's that innate strength to remain yourself or it's some, hopefully strong enough, immovable enough belief that you will be able to bear witness to the thing that's beyond all civilization and still come out yourself on the other end. Or maybe it's not that deep. Maybe you're right, Taylor. I definitely did have that thought, like usual. It's just more interesting to me to argue the other side. So, yeah, it could just be a good adventure story.
Well, I think we've probably hit on some of the more profound aspects of it. I'm not sure it's what exactly what anyone wants it to be, but it's a good story for sure. So, all right. So with that, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.